It's really saying that this guy who was crucified by the Romans is the Messiah, and that makes them angry. They throw him out, and then he goes to the Gentiles. And once it becomes a bigger deal and there's more commotion, then they have to leave that town. It happens over and over and over, right? So it's interesting that this is a pattern that he gets used to.
And he wasn't stoned on the first missionary journey too?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's not just like, hey, people are mad. It's like people are trying to kill you.
Hey friends, welcome back. We're picking up right after Paul's mind-blowing encounter with Jesus on that dusty road in Damascus. It was one of those moments where everything you know just gets turned inside out, right? The guy who was absolutely set on taking down the Jesus movement suddenly finds himself in a house he doesn't know, completely blinded. And the next thing that happens is a man comes to the house and heals him. So this is quite a surprising turn for Paul, because he was like the big enforcer dude, right? He was going to go up there and lay down the law, if you will. And now he's in need of God's grace in order to move forward in his life. And I mean, just when you think that's very dramatic, something else dramatic happens, which is he slips away into the Arabian desert. He goes away for quite a few years. And this period is kind of a timeline when we might skip over that. But N.T. Wright, who's our authority for this podcast, says it was when God went to work on Paul's heart in a whole new way. And I love the thought of that. So here we are together again, Jeremiah. What's your thinking about where we are with Paul and his journey right now?
Well, obviously, we left the last episode as a cliffhanger of he lost his sight. So I'm anxious to hear about how this unfolds. I do have a question for you about Paul regarding this evolution of his faith. Anecdotally, when I've learned about Paul in the past, Paul always struck me, right? He's a lawyer, struck me as almost a jerk, right? Like he's very black and white. He's very dogmatic. He's very certain of himself. I mean, you'd have to be to go execute people or be a part of that process. And when you see his conversion, now obviously Jesus himself came down to him, shined a light on him. Do you think that shows Paul's possible humility or passion for truth? Or do you think that he had no choice but to change his belief system because his Lord came down to him and confronted him?
I think it was the latter instead of the former. I think it was that the encounter on the road with Jesus just totally shook him to the core. Like everything he thought he knew. You know how we can become so proud about what we know and how we
I don't at all.
How certain people can be really stubborn and just think they know it. Like my husband will say to me, Rich will say to me, "Oh, you're wrong with conviction," which is probably accurate. Like I think I know it, but I'm not sure, but I just say it like I know it, right? And I try to make it the truth, but he catches me on that. And I think Paul felt very confident, extremely confident, if you will. I mean, you call him a jerk. He was probably arrogant about it because he was so bright and so smart. And he just thought he had the whole world at his disposal. And then all of a sudden, everything, as we talked about, gets turned upside down. And what a humbling experience it was. Not only did he fall over in the road and was lying there kind of helpless and had to be led into the city, but he's blinded, which is shocking. I mean, think about that. Like you're lying there. No doubt you're wondering, how long will I be blind? Is this a forever thing? What's going to happen? And people talk about those 3 days, right, in the dark.
An interesting
what do you-
symmetry there of
What do
3
you think
comes up a
about the
lot.
3-day, right?
I don't know. Like, isn't it? It's got to be something, right? That's the number of Jesus in the tomb. That's the number of Paul in darkness. Lazarus was even down for 3 days, wasn't he?
A little longer, but yeah, 3 days.
Okay.
I mean, rhetorically, he was.
Okay, so
sure.
it's weird how that's the number. I don't know if God's trying to tell us something or that's just what it was. I don't know.
It's very common in the Jewish text and even in the New Testament that numbers, excuse me, numbers have meaning. There's 3, there's 7, which is perfection. There's 6, which is not perfection. There's 12, right, which is the number of apostles and the number of tribes. There's 40. So like when Moses went to the mountain for 40 days and Jesus was in the desert for 40 days. So yeah, these numbers have meaning. And in this case, it does echo this theme of death and resurrection in Jewish thought. So it does strip away it's a period of time where his confidence in what he knows is completely stripped away. So, but God has something else in mind for him, right? And let's go to what that is. When he sends Ananias, which is
tell me a little bit about him, because I don't know a ton about this guy.
I don't really know much about him either. He's obviously a follower of the way. Let's read what it says about him. 9:7. I'm in Acts 9. I'm at 17:19. Then, okay, so in Damascus, there was a disciple. So he's a disciple. The Lord called to him in a vision, Ananias. Yes, Lord, he answered. The Lord told him, go to the house of Judas on Straight Street. Very interesting that it's a specific direction. Go on to this street and ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he is praying. So we get a little insight there. He's praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight. So he's saying, basically, Paul knows you're coming. And Lord, said Ananias, I have heard many reports about this man and all of the harm he has done to your people in Jerusalem. And he has come here with authority from the chief priest to arrest all who call on your name. So what's he saying there? I'm afraid.
Yeah, which is fascinating to me because you think of Damascus is not terribly close to Jerusalem by those standards, by the standards of that day, right? So he already knew of Paul. He knew he was coming there to do this. I mean, word traveled fast because Paul got his papers and left from the way of the story. We understand the story. Maybe he hung out for a few days, but that word got there quick. He knew Paul's reputation preceded him, which goes back to Paul was kind of a psycho, right? And then Ananias was scared to death, which why wouldn't he be?
He would be. He's thinking this guy could arrest me, drag me back to Jerusalem. He'd already watched why Stephen was killed and stoned. So yeah, you would be afraid. But now, you are talking to the Lord. He is appearing to you in a vision. And the Lord said to Ananias, go, like a command, like emphatic. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. So he's basically predicting, look, it's going to be an important job, but it's not going to be an easy job.
Right.
And I've chosen him. So this isn't up for debate. This is like, you have to go. And off he goes. He goes to the house. He puts his hands on Saul's eyes, and he is immediately healed. Something like scales, they say, fell from his eyes, and he could see again. And right after that, he was baptized, which also is a beautiful thing to think that just as Jesus modeled, he becomes baptized before he starts his missionary journey. So it's an important moment for Paul to now figure out what's he going to do. I mean, what's next? What's next?
And he jumps to action pretty quick, right?
Yeah, I think I think he decides, well, this is what I need to do. I need to go out immediately and start preaching. I mean, he's preaching about the Jesus that he saw on that road. He's teaching about his own conversion. He's teaching based on what he knows as a Pharisee combined with what he personally experienced. And I think we're to remember that he hadn't had any interaction with the apostles in Jerusalem, right, at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever he's teaching is his own insight given to him by Jesus. It's knowledge given to him by Jesus. So definitely seeing Paul go from, I'm coming up here to be a persecutor, to here I am, a proclaimer that Jesus is the Messiah, would have been confounding, right? Surprising.
Well, you would have had to think it was a bait and switch, right? Like he's doing this to draw you in to get you.
Yeah. So how do you think his message was received then?
With trepidation, right? It had to have been. Of just like, what's going on here? Now, I think I want to go back because you said something a thread that I want to pull on of Jesus gave Paul, you said something like knowledge or I don't recall exactly what you said, but this idea that Jesus showed Paul something new. And I wonder, I'm not saying that's inaccurate, but I wonder how much of that is Paul already knew everything. He just had to change his focus or his optic a little bit. That Jesus clearly did, to make this make sense. Because us from modernity, when we look at the story of Scripture, there's clearly a fall and then this path of redemption, this arc that's woven throughout history. And Paul, I think, just saw that like, oh my gosh, this is what all my studies actually meant. It was leading towards the Messiah. It was leading towards the King. And here it is. I need to go talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that he's gleaning or has insight that the apostles don't have, because they have firsthand knowledge, firsthand experience. But Paul's point is that I also have firsthand experience meeting the resurrected Christ.
Okay.
Therefore, that's how he claims and accurately claims that he is also an apostle, because he has firsthand experience with the Lord. And he's there teaching in Damascus. It's not going that well, honestly. He's trying, but the opposition is coming against him. I'm certain you had, Jews in that area who were like, hey, wait a minute. You were supposed to come here and gather up these people and take them away. It doesn't sound like that's what you're going to do.
Well, he formed enemies everywhere, right? Because the followers of the way are clearly going to be skeptical of who he is. The traditionalists are like, what are you doing? This is the complete opposite. And there's probably just the people like, you're creating a mess. Like, you're messing up my day. I got to go get to work. Like, what are you doing here? Leave.
He's troublesome. Nobody knows what to do with him. I mean, that's the way that I think about it. The leaders of the Jewish leadership is like, hey, what's going on? The Christian leaders are also, hey, what's going on? They're both kind of firmly in the same camp. We don't know yet. And ultimately, Paul has to leave Damascus. And that's kind of a dramatic thing, because he talks about how he was lowered in a basket outside the city walls of Damascus in order to get out, and in hiding. Like, he has to hide in a basket and get lowered to the ground in order to get out. So, I mean, right off the bat, we see him encountering the trials and some of the suffering that Jesus said was going to happen to him.
Well, and immediately you think this guy's figured out. He's got an answer. He knows what he's supposed to do. He meets with resistance everywhere, has to be lowered in a basket, and then disappears into, the story's kind of odd here because it just goes to Arabia. Like,
Yeah.
He's just gone to Arabia. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm certain at this point now he is on foot. Like I think he was on the road. I think he had an animal, donkey, horses, because he had people with him. Um, but here it says, let's see. Okay. In Damascus, this is the story that Paul tells about Damascus. In Damascus, the governor under King Aretas had the city of Damascus guarded in order to arrest me. So the king is guarding Damascus, trying to prevent him from leaving, trying to arrest him. But I was lowered in a basket from a window in the wall and slipped through his hands. I like that visual because this is also something that happened to Jesus, right? He would be close to being captured and he would slip away. And, he has skills or the grace of God with him in this process. But yeah, he goes to Arabia. And, Arabia is not far from where he already is. It's a very big region. So he's there in the desert. And what's he doing there?
You tell me. I mean, we have our assumptions, right? Like he's probably trying to find shelter and food and not get killed. And then I bet you there's a ton of wrestling with God of just, probably guilt, confusion, trying to understand, okay, now you give me this plan, but now I'm stuck. I had to escape with barely my life through a basket. Like I'm a guy that's the smartest person, been trained my whole life for this, and now I'm running away from a basket, Yeah.
I mean, I think that he rightfully came to the conclusion that I need a little more time. I need more time to figure out what this all means and how I'm going to put it together. He's brilliant, but he's also wrestling with, this is not the Messiah I signed up for. He's crucified, hanging on a tree. It's embarrassing. It's humiliating. It's, it cannot be the Messiah we were waiting for. But I saw him on the road, and now he's going to try to pull, like you say, this arc of the whole story. He's probably thinking every day in his mind about the Torah and looking for all of the signs that it was going to be Jesus.
Wright had a quote that I found interesting here of he thought this is the time when Paul worked out the idea that salvation is not from the law, the works of the law. Salvation is from his Messiah. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's absolutely what his entire theology is about. His entire theology is that salvation comes from God. It does not come from our own works and our own efforts. So let's say that's what's going on. Then for sure he's there trying to wrestle with, but wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to be following the law in specific detail, and that the details were what mattered in terms of how God saw us. He would see me as more or less holy based on me adhering to all the specific details. And now none of that matters?
Right.
That doesn't matter?
And this is, a huge point of conflict with Paul, right? Because many people got confused and used Paul as an idea to demonize Jewish people of Jewish ancestry and to show the Jews were wrong. And that was a whole thread that got pulled on, which I don't see that there at all. But clearly the law matters now. It mattered then. It just does something different than what we thought. It changed over time is probably what you and I's theological beliefs would be. But it's not like it just dissolved it to nothingness. It still was a thing that a whole entire civilization was built upon and was a tool to get us to connect with our Creator.
Yeah, it was God's design. God designed it. So there was a purpose for it. But part of it was all of the prophetic messages around a Messiah is coming, and it turns out that it's Jesus. So everything that was in the law and all the prophecy had to continue to a conclusion, had to be fulfilled as God said it would be. So Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also what Paul is arguing, that, if you look from the beginning to the end, he is the one who fulfills the law, who fulfills all the prophecies, and there is none other than him. Nobody else is coming, in other words.
Right.
This is it. It's kind of hard for people to recognize that when you're living in the moment that that's happening, that's a surprise, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you're living in a dramatic, transformational time, it's a surprise to you. But there it is. You can either deny it, as some of the Jewish leaders did, or you can embrace it, as some of the...
I think that any of the transformational times in your life, I know for sure in mine, they aren't what I was expecting. And then it's a struggle, because you're like, oh, I thought this was supposed to be this, and it's not. And I'm not necessarily even to the point where I can deal with what it is. I'm just sad that it isn't what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. I mean, he might have had some of that conflict in his mind. Here's what N.T. Wright says about this time. He's talking about Galatians. And this is what Paul actually wrote in Galatians 1:15-17. He says, when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to unveil his Son to me, so that I might announce the good news about him among the nations. Immediately, I did not confer with flesh and blood. And what's he saying? What's he saying there? He's saying, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me. No, I went away to Arabia and afterwards returned to Damascus. So, once again, he's talking about, I didn't confer with the apostles. This was given to me. I received the information, and the first thing I did was go to Arabia. And to your point, N.T. Wright sees this as, he's wrestling with this idea that the law had been fulfilled in Christ, shifting his understanding of the covenants that had happened in the Old Testament, and that this is, as Wright says, the foundation of Paul's gospel, as you said, salvation by faith, apart from the works of the law. Yeah. So that time was probably really critical, those 3 years. He's still a young man, right?
Since we're the timeline folks, he's about 30 now after he comes back from the desert-ish?
I would think that's probably right. Yeah, he's 30-ish. And I don't always have the timeline right in front of me.
I think it's all memorized in your head.
I'm not that smart. I'm not as smart as Paul. So he probably undoubtedly had the timeline in his head. But so I think the 3 years, and I just would have to say, aren't there times when we need to go to Arabia?
No. I hate Arabia.
I like Arabia.
No, actually, metaphorically, I hate it. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I get stuck there often.
Metaphorically.
Mm-hmm.
Can you learn to love the fact that you need that time? I think you can.
Yeah, I think that I struggle with the idea that, go back to like the first time we learned about Arabia or the desert, let's say. It came down to the fact that they were wandering around in the desert for 40 years. I'm talking about the Israelites, because they couldn't figure their stuff out. So I always wonder, like, how much of this desert is because I'm just dumb? I can't figure this out. And that's one of my biggest frustrations in those times, which seem plentiful.
I don't think it's dumb. I think it's working on you. Like, God is always drawing you closer to him. He's always drawing you in. But there's always work to be done. And sometimes you have to do that in solitude. Sometimes you have to do that in community, within your marriage, in your marriage. But yeah, if you need that solitude to work through it, it's better just to relinquish and say, okay, what are you trying to teach me, than it is to don't feel like it's your fault. There's so much to learn. There's so much to know. Here's another quote from N.T. Wright that I think about the desert time. N.T. writes, whether on foot or by donkey, one does not go for several days into a desert just to find a quiet spot to pray. Saul wanted to be clear that the shocking new thing that had been revealed to him really was the fulfillment, the surprising but ultimate satisfying goal of the ancient purpose of the one God, purposes that had been set out particularly in the law given to Moses on Mount Sinai. He wanted to stay loyal. Saul was starting to come to terms with the possibility that if the divine purposes had been completed in Jesus, it might mean that a whole new phase of the divine plan, hitherto barely suspected, had now been launched. A phase in which the Torah itself would be seen in a whole new light.
That's a lot.
It is. So I just gives us some insight into, Wright thinks that, okay, he wants to stay loyal to God. So he has to see it as a whole new phase of the plan, as we kind of talked about, something totally new and unexpected. But he also had to think, well, this is the right plan. I don't want to be deceived. I don't want to be led astray. So after his time in the desert, where does he go? He goes to Jerusalem. Yeah, this is 3 years after his conversion. Because he went to Damascus, he went to the desert, then he came back to Damascus. And then he went to Jerusalem. And
which I've always like, if you're under the chief priest, like, hey, bro, what happened? Like, I sent you on this mission and it's 3 years later and now you're kind of weird.
Well, he doesn't tell us about that.
Yeah.
I know you like to think, I mean, did they know he was there? He was there for only 15 days. So it was limited in scope. I really don't think he is interested in going back and telling the story at that point. I mean, maybe he thought.
Well, and also my theory is Caiaphas, because Caiaphas went away. And I think that Paul, this is my theory, there's no scholarly evidence to support this. Don't call me out or do whatever. I think he left under Caiaphas. And when he came back, it was a new chief priest. Oh. And like nobody really.
Do you have a timeline for that somewhere? Or it's just like.
I did. So yeah, I don't have it in front of me and I don't have it memorized because we're not Paul. We've already gone over this territory. Caiaphas was transitioned out of power somewhere around this time.
I mean, there's always another high priest.
They come and go. The new high priest is like, I don't know. There wasn't a briefing. There's not a memo on you. I don't know. I don't even care.
The term high priest stays with you after you're the high priest. It's just that you're not the high priest in power. So it's like how we call the president, even though they might not be a president anymore. I don't know, something like that. Okay. So he goes to Jerusalem, and I said it's a brief visit, and he only sees Peter and James. Those are the only two people he sees. He calls Peter Cephas, and James, not the full apostolic council. So not all of them are there listening to what Paul has to say. Here again is what N.T. Wright says. In any case, to Jerusalem, Paul then goes, most likely in 36 AD or 37. Writing to the Galatians over a decade later, he explains that he stayed with Peter for 2 weeks, seeing no other Jesus followers except James, the Lord's brother, already acknowledged as the central figure in the new movement. The meeting was set up by Barnabas. The Jewish leaders were understandably suspicious, but Barnabas assured them that Saul really had seen Jesus on the road, and that in Damascus he really had been boldly proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah. So far, one might think, so good. So, yeah, there he is. He's talking to them, just the two of them. What's he talking about? What's he talking about?
Yes, I don't know.
He's talking about his conversion. I think he's talking about that this was all divinely inspired.
Mm-hmm.
I was set apart from birth, he said.
Right. Yeah, I wonder how much of that he came back and was able to put those pieces together later, how much of that he was aware of in the moment. I mean, obviously, Paul's a smart guy. He's trained in debate. He's trained in logical thinking. So he was probably making a case for himself and as to what God is doing there to convince them.
That's what I think. I think he's going there and he's saying, I get it. You're concerned. There's a lot of skepticism. You're wondering, okay, what the heck happened? Who are you? Should we trust you? And, he's really using this time to introduce his new self.
Mm-hmm. Right? Which is interesting that it's Peter, right? Because if anybody knows what it's like to have faith and lose faith and get it again, it's Peter, right?
Yeah. Also interesting that it's James, because James met Jesus for real after he was resurrected. We don't know when and where, but kind of the same thing.
Right.
James the brother.
Right.
I think it was James the brother. Yeah. And
do we know that?
I think it is.
Okay. I always get confused there.
Well, there is two Jameses. Yeah. The Lord's brother.
Okay.
That's what N.T. Wright says.
So you'd think that he would be able to. Yeah, it's interesting. It's those two folks, right? Like it's Peter and it's James. They're the ones that, I mean, outside of, our good friend Thomas, who's the doubter, right? Yeah, they would probably be the most familiar with what this journey's like because James didn't believe and then started to believe, right?
Yeah. After he saw his brother resurrected.
Mm-hmm. So it's like, that's your own brother, you kind of probably thought he was cuckoo, right?
Yeah. His family definitely think he had mental issues. They came to get him, to take him home. And Jesus is like, oh, no. Yeah. Anyway, that's a different discussion. But so I don't know what Paul's expecting to have happen, but I don't think it goes down the way he thought it might.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Because, N.T. Wright makes a good point here. And that is, they're probably thinking this guy is a troublemaker. Here he is again, our troublemaker. Mm-hmm. First, he's going to cause trouble going to Damascus. And then he causes trouble in Damascus. And now he's here. And do we really want him, kicking up the stones and causing a big kerfuffle over everything?
For sure, because cool, you converted, but you're still a hot mess. Like you're kind of toxic. Go away.
You're kind of toxic, and also, the N.T. Wright says they don't want the trouble, and trouble coming just a few years after the stoning of Stephen is something that Jesus believers can do without. Mm-hmm. So what do they do with Paul? They escort him down to the Sea of Caesarea and put him on a boat. And they send him home.
Imagine that you're going home after he's been gone he may have made visits back to see his family, but he's moving back home after all of this. And everybody's like, what's up? And I don't know, man. I met Jesus.
Yeah. A few things have happened since I last saw you.
Yeah.
It's like coming home to a family reunion when you haven't seen people in a long time. And they're like, hey, what's your story? What have you been up to? And you're like, okay, do I actually tell this story or
right?
Or
it's
not?
like it's the quintessential cliche. You went off to do your thing and you failed. So now you're back here with all of us. Cool.
And he was there for quite a while. And you mentioned this. He's there
a decade,
for
right?
7 to 10 years. Yeah. He's
probably
also
going back
in
to his
Antioch.
dad's business.
Yeah, he did. No doubt. That's exactly what he did. N.T.
Which,
Wright
think
talks
about
about
that,
that.
because like you are a scholar, lawyer, trained by the best, and now I don't think those folks want to go back to doing labor with their life.
Well, here's what Wright says about it. First, and straightforwardly, we must assume that Saul set to and earned his own living in the family business. Back to the family business. As we saw earlier, he was a tent maker, which involved general skill with leather and fabric of various kinds, as well as a specific manufacture of actual tents, awnings, and so on. So Jewish teachers did not expect to make a living from their teaching.
Okay.
Saul, as a strange new type of Jewish teacher, would not suppose that going about announcing the crucified Jesus as Israel's Messiah and the world's Lord would earn him a living.
Probably not a lucrative endeavor.
Yeah, it's not going to earn him a living. His craft was hard physical labor. And his subsequent apostolic letters show that the apostle took a pride in supporting himself by manual labor. So, yeah, he's a worker. He's working with his hands and with his family. So I guess we might assume his family was cool with what happened, right? Like
maybe they were. Maybe they're just like, well, you're one of us, so we have to accept you. But again, going back to the previous thought of like, if you follow the assumptions that we made about his parents are devout, abiders of the law, abiders of Torah. They sent him to go study with the best of the best. I gotta imagine there was a little bit of like, say what? Like, you disappear for all this time, and now you're here telling us you met some dude and blinded you? I mean, yeah, maybe that went off great, but nothing else in the story's gone off great for him, right? I gotta imagine that was difficult too.
No doubt about it. Yeah, just in our own mind, we could assume that, we sent him off. He's no doubt, I'm certain they know some of the story. Like, it didn't go that well. But he comes back. It's saying that, your kids, I don't want to say anything that would be casting a dispersion, but like your kid's on track to become a doctor, and he comes back and he says, I'm a poet, right?
Right.
So You're different. Like, not that there's anything wrong with being a poet. It's 100%. It's a lost
but
art,
we get the metaphor.
Yeah. And I don't know. I think the fact that they allowed him to come back and be a tent maker with him speaks to their grace in the situation. So he's there, he's working. And for Paul, this had to be a hard time, right? We don't know a lot about it. It's kind of like Paul's not documenting it. He's not sharing what he's thinking, but we might think of it as this time of patience, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had been called by God, called by the Lord, but not, and he thought he had been sent immediately, right?
Mm-hmm.
Immediately was sent.
As if that.
Yeah, he acted like that. Instead, he's back home, living with his parents, making tents, thinking about what's next. It's, again, when we're on our path and our journey with finding our place in the kingdom of God, we don't always know exactly what God has in mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, never.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we can hold the promises true, right? He's not here to hurt us or destroy us, but the path isn't what we would choose.
Yeah. Well, he does have some times of preaching and suffering during this time. It's not like he's completely quiet. And he notes this in 2 Corinthians, because, of course, what's happening to him, he's just being rejected, right? But even rejection can hone you into a better person. It teaches you what's going to have the skills you need to learn to not be rejected. I'm trying to see if I can find it here quickly. So, yeah. I can't find it right now, but let's just assume we know he was persecuted for his messages, and also this is a time of manual labor for him.
Mm-hmm.
So then comes this period of time where he decides, I'm going to start pursuing my calling in a real way. And he goes on his first missionary journey. This is probably from 47 to 49 AD.
Now, something I'm unclear of, did he decide this, or did Barnabas come be like, hey, bro, we got something we got to go do. Let's go.
Well, actually, around 46 AD, there was news that the Gentiles were coming to faith in Antioch. And this reached the Jerusalem church. This is in Acts 11. And seeing the growth, they realized they needed help. So Barnabas travels to Tarsus to find Paul and to bring him to Antioch. And this really was a turning point for Paul, because instead of being in Tarsus doing some preaching and being rejected and suffering and working on his tent making skills, he's now brought into a new community. It's a new community of thriving, diverse Christians. And by the way, it's in Antioch that the term Christians first came to be attached to the people who were followers of Jesus. So this now is a launching pad for his missionary work. He's no longer kind of on his own. He's with a group of people who believe the same thing he does and who want to spread the message about Jesus. So it's definitely a new adventure for him. And no doubt it was something that he wanted to have happen. I mean, he wanted to move forward. And he did believe that his true calling was to bring the gospel to all the nations. He says that in Romans. But God's timing was different. And so, he had to spend all that time in preparation before he was fully released onto the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he definitely wanted it to start sooner rather than later. But, the scale of Paul's work is huge. I mean, it cannot really be understated how significant the size of his work is, how many places he traveled, how many miles he walked, how many churches he planted, how many lives he touched, how much he was instrumental in really rooting Jesus's message somewhere where it would grow like wildfire. So it's a very, very big job, something that we sometimes lose sight of. But
absolutely. I mean, have you looked in prep for this? I looked at all the maps again,
Yeah, the maps are amazing.
It's especially his second one, I believe it is. Like, the dude was everywhere. And then these numbers might be slightly off. If I remember right, there's 27 books in the New Testament. And he wrote 13 of them, and something like 20 to 25% of the word count in the New Testament was written by Paul. So obviously, immensely foundational, and it's called out, right? Like, he's the one that's going to bring the church to the Gentiles. He did. Yeah. I mean, that was the key he was the key that did that.
Well, it is true that he was quite instrumental in breaking new ground and also addressing so many issues that were coming up. I mean, that's what the letters are all about. Mm-hmm. If you're starting a whole new thing, stuff is going to happen. Issues are going to come up. Questions are going to be asked. And who did they look to for the answers? They looked to Paul. So Paul uses Antioch as his first base of operations. And he stayed there for about a year before embarking on his first missionary journey. And that's what he did next. This is in Acts 11, 25 to 26. So it's during this time that he and Barnabas taught way more followers, Gentile believers, really reaching out to them and shaping Antioch into a major Christian center. So when was his first missionary journey? Around 47 to 49 AD. Acts 13 records that the Holy Spirit called Paul and Barnabas for a special mission, and the church commissioned them for their journey. And they spent, I don't even know how long. It's important to remember, though, that the idea of the journey, it just wasn't Paul's idea. It was also the Antioch church's idea, Barnabas's idea, and the Holy Spirit. So they went out. I haven't actually listed out all the places that they went, but, they're definitely out and about. On the map, did you see how far they went in the first time? I think they were only on land in the first time.
Yeah, I believe that's true. The first time is definitely the smallest of them, right? I mean, just because it makes sense. Foundationally, you don't need to reach quite as far for what they're doing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Uh-huh.
And then it also makes sense that he's not only preaching, he's learning, right? He's learning about the problems and the conflicts. And then he's got a whole other thing that he's got to go do now from what he's learned from what's happening being boots on the ground.
Mm-hmm. I found some cities here. It says that they traveled through Cyprus, Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, preaching in cities like Pisidian, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. So, they are getting around to the Gentile world, but they're also facing opposition. It's not like they're just walking in and everybody's embracing him. Paul kind of sets a pattern for how he's going to manage this process. And the pattern is that they first go in and they find a synagogue. And the synagogue is where, and they're always welcomed, at least in the beginning, at the synagogue, right? Because it's a place where if you're Jewish, you can go and meet with your community, and where you're often free to speak because, here comes Paul. He is a renowned Torah scholar, and they're thinking, well, he's going to talk about his knowledge of the Torah. And instead he comes and he preaches the message of Jesus, and people are really unhappy with his message. And so the pattern is he goes and he speaks at a synagogue until they figure out what he's really saying. What's he really saying? He's really saying that this guy who was crucified by the Romans is the Messiah, and that makes them angry. They throw him out, and then he goes to the Gentiles. And once it becomes a bigger deal and there's more commotion, then they have to leave that town. It happens over and over and over, right? So it's interesting that this is a pattern that he gets used to.
And he wasn't stoned on the first missionary journey too?
Yeah.
I mean, so it's not just like, hey, people are mad. It's like people are trying to kill you.
Exactly. This was in Lystra. He was stoned and left for dead. And this is the opposition that Paul would constantly face. Jewish leaders rejected him, while Gentiles were either intrigued or hostile. So say what you will, it wasn't a total fertile ground that had been plowed.
Right.
In preparation for him coming. It was rough terrain. Yeah. I love the fact that he continued no matter what. Like, he just stuck it out. His tenacity, like you called him, well, you said he was stubborn, right? You said he was stubborn. You also called him a jerk. He had that kind of personality. When you run up against him, he's not going to bow down. In fact, we can see in this first journey that he becomes the leader. Like, Barnabas is with him, but he's actually the leader because the language shifts from Barnabas and Paul went here to Paul and Barnabas. And this is kind of it's kind of a sign that Paul was really stepping into his apostolic role. Very important. So they go and they do what they need to do. And they did have some success. There was miraculous signs that happened. And things like after Paul nearly getting killed, he gets up and continues his journey. So this first journey was encounters, miracles, and divine protection. That's the way that we can think about it. So finally, they go back to Jerusalem. And when they go back to Jerusalem, They are there for a specific reason, and they're there to report what happened, but also to deal with a growing issue that they see emerging. And I think we're going to have to leave that for our next podcast. What was the issue? What happened when they went to Jerusalem? They convened the Jerusalem Council. And it was at this council that some things got discussed and decided about what was the nature of being a Christian? What did it really mean to become a Christian? And how did you become a Christian? Two important, really important topics. So how do you feel about Paul now that we've gone through this part?
It's, how do I feel about Paul now? I am always struck by, it seems like anybody specifically in scripture that went and did amazing things had a lot of, let's just call it downtime. A lot of time, we can call it being prepared, waiting, being molded, however we want to frame it. And I think we always get because we're used to our quick movies. Like there's a hero, the hero has to go save the world tomorrow, right? And I think that's how we want these stories to unfold. And it's always striking to me the tenacity to wait 10 years. And, you know, he wasn't necessarily just stuck in a basement waiting, but still he wasn't doing, I got to assume, especially those 10 years in Tarsus, he wasn't doing what he felt like God Jesus called him to do, right? Go take this message to the Gentiles. And especially you think of the arc of it, of, okay, he's called, he starts right away, it goes badly, he has to get out in a basket, he then goes and hangs out in the desert for 3 years. And so he's like, okay, I did my desert time, it's now time to start. He walks to Jerusalem, probably like, cool, I'm the key, let's make this happen. They're like, here's a boat, you need to leave. And then he goes home, right? I mean, that's some mental fortitude to work through all that. And I guess nothing great comes without a great cost, right? And he paid the cost over continually through the course of his life. And it's fun to see him that way and not just some, I think when you glance through the story, he can feel like a silver spoon character, right? He was super smart and he had this affluent family and got him trained in the best school. And then he was really bad, but Jesus called him and his life was, miraculous when he kind of waited a lot.
Yeah. I love the way you describe that as, the hurry up and wait. Like, it is amazing how he was able to navigate that, but he was so certain about his calling. And I think that even today, when you are certain that God is calling you to do something, you have to have patience because it takes a lot for all the pieces to come together, right?
Absolutely.
It's not like, even though the encounter on the road felt like a big magician's kind of scenario with light and bright lights and going blind, the actual process of doing it, of undertaking it, is this tedious every single day. You have to live through the day and something happens, and there's times when nothing happens. And I love that you bring that up so that we don't think of it as a movie, but we think about it as a real life being played out right in front of us.
Absolutely.
So I'm excited about what's going to happen next, and I'm excited about our journey with Paul. And I want to encourage people, by the way, I do have a document that you can get for free on my website. You can download it. It's called Paul's Path, and it really does walk through these specific things that happened and the decades of him serving God. So I want to encourage you to get that PDF. Just go to the website, sandylaws.com, and pick that up. And follow along with us. It's great. Hope that everybody enjoyed today. I did.
Awesome. Me too. Thanks for keeping me along, Sandy, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.